When my sister's boyfriend made that joke at the Christmas table, I smiled instead of crying. I remember the way my face reacted before my heart had time to speak. It was automatic. A small smile, barely noticeable, just enough to meet the social expectation of the moment. A polite laugh, soft and controlled, almost like a whisper that no one could truly pin down. Everyone else laughed too, and the sound rolled across the table like it had always belonged there. Forks paused in the air, clinking against plates. Glasses hovered halfway to mouths, catching the light of the Christmas tree behind us. For everyone else, the room felt full and bright, like nothing bad had happened at all. Their laughter filled the space, wrapping around the room, warm and easy, and I could feel it brushing past me, trying to include me. But inside me, something went quiet. A small hollow space opened, deep in my chest, almost unnoticed at first but persistent. My heartbeat slowed in response, as if trying to keep me from revealing the stirrings of old, familiar sadness. The Christmas lights behind us blinked softly, red and gold and green, casting gentle reflections on the window like tiny stars dancing on the glass. They glimmered, oblivious to the tension in my chest. The smell of roasted turkey mixed with cinnamon and warm bread. The comforting aroma should have felt safe. It should have felt like home, but it didn't. The joke stayed with me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't the kind of joke that makes people gasp or go silent. That's what made it worse. It settled into a quiet corner of my mind, lingering in a way that the laughter around the table could not reach. Because everyone thought it was harmless. Everyone thought it was funny. But for me, it landed differently. I told myself not to be sensitive. I told myself it was just humor. I told myself Christmas was not the time to feel hurt. But my chest felt tight, and my hands felt cold against the smooth surface of the table. My fingers wrapped around the fork, knuckles paling slightly, as I forced myself to continue smiling. Stopping would have drawn attention, and attention has never been my strength. It always seemed heavier than I could carry. I have always been the one who keeps things smooth. The one who nods, quietly agreeing to maintain peace. The one who lets moments pass without comment, hoping that quiet endurance will be enough. I learned a long time ago that silence can make life easier for everyone else. It is a survival skill, really, cultivated over years of careful observation and subtle self-restraint. That night, I laughed again when someone added another joke, a soft, polite chuckle that blended into the symphony of holiday cheer. I passed the potatoes, asking gently if anyone wanted more gravy. I played my role well. Externally, I moved through the motions of the evening flawlessly. Internally, though, I felt small, exposed, like someone had reached into my past and pulled out a truth I was not ready to face. Later, when the table was cleared and the laughter moved to another room, I stayed behind. I lingered a moment longer than anyone else, my hands brushing over the crumbs left behind, tracing the wine rings on the tablecloth. I stared at the empty plates, at the faint reflection of lights in the polished silverware, at the quiet that seemed to hum in the corners of the room. That was when I realized something painful. The joke hurt not because it was said, but because part of me believed it. And once a feeling like that settles in, it doesn't leave quietly. It grows in the spaces you ignore. It follows you into the corners of your mind. Christmas has always been important in our family, not because everything was perfect, but because it was the one time we truly tried to be together. No matter what had happened during the year, arguments, small disappointments, unspoken tensions, we showed up. We cooked. We set the table. We sat at the same table. We acted like that was enough, like being present could somehow replace understanding or connection. My mother's house was where it always happened. It was an old place with narrow hallways that creaked underfoot, as if the house itself remembered every step we had ever taken. The floors groaned when you walked too fast, reminding you that you were not alone in your movements. That history lingered in the wood and plaster. The kitchen was small, but warm, like a pocket of safety in the otherwise sprawling and slightly chaotic house. Even when there wasn't enough space, people naturally gathered there, drawn to the hum of activity, to the smells of roasting food, to the quiet promise of togetherness. That house held our history, whether we wanted to remember it or not. It held the echoes of laughter and arguments, whispered secrets and shouted frustrations. Every corner seemed to have a memory etched into it, from the faded wallpaper in the hallway to the chipped wooden banister on the stairs. I am the older sister. I came into the world first, and I learned early how to observe, how to wait, how to listen. I learned quickly that being seen sometimes brought expectations, sometimes brought friction. I learned that silence could be a shield and observation a form of power. My sister Lily came 2 years later, full of energy and sound. She cried louder as a baby, a wail that pulled the adults from every corner of the house. She laughed louder as a child, a sound that ricocheted off the walls and filled the spaces between the furniture. And as we grew, she filled rooms without even trying, a presence that demanded acknowledgement simply by being herself. People noticed her immediately. Teachers smiled when she raised her hand, impressed by her confidence and charisma. Relatives leaned forward when she spoke, drawn to her warmth and the spark in her eyes. Strangers remembered her name after one meeting, charmed by the ease with which she navigated the world. And me? I stood beside her, holding jackets, holding bags, holding space. I learned early that I could support without needing the spotlight. I could watch without being seen, and sometimes that felt safer. I don't say this with bitterness. It is simply the truth of how things unfolded. Lily did not steal attention. It came to her naturally, like sunlight spilling into a room. And I learned to live in the background because someone had to. Because life has a way of rewarding those who step forward and punishing those who step wrong, and I wanted to survive. As children, we shared a bedroom. 2 twin beds, 2 desks, 1 window that let in morning light filtered through yellowing curtains. At night, Lily would talk until she fell asleep. She told stories that stretched across fantastical lands and heroic adventures. She shared dreams of what the future might hold. I listened in the dark, my body curled into my blanket, responding only when needed, a quiet echo to her loud narrative. She once asked me why I was so quiet. I told her I liked listening. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that being quiet felt safer. When I spoke less, I made fewer mistakes. When I stayed calm, I kept the peace. I learned that early, watching the adults around us navigate their own tensions, watching the arguments that sparked over small missteps, the sighs and raised voices, the sharp words softened with laughter. Our parents loved us, but they were tired people. Life had not been gentle with them. There were bills to pay, deadlines to meet, disappointments to soothe, and worries that never left the room. Lily brought them laughter, exuberant and unchecked, while I brought them relief, a quiet kind of reassurance that kept the household tethered together. I was the child who did not add to the noise, the one who finished homework on time without reminders, the one who noticed when moods shifted, who could feel tension tighten in the air before words were even spoken. I became very good at reading rooms, at understanding the subtle cues that others overlooked. That skill followed me into adulthood, a silent toolkit I carried with me everywhere. At school, I did well, but quietly. I didn't raise my hand unless I was certain. I didn't speak unless I had something safe to say. Teachers described me as sweet and well-behaved. No one ever said I was bold. I was reliable, predictable, the steady undercurrent that rarely caused ripples. Lily, on the other hand, tried everything. Sports, drama, debate. She failed sometimes, but she failed loudly and bounced back quickly, her energy undimmed by mistakes. People admired that. They gravitated toward her resilience, while I learned the art of careful observation, of self-restraint, of waiting for the right moment to step forward. When we grew older and went our separate ways, the pattern remained. Lily moved through life confidently, claiming space without apology. I moved carefully, sometimes hesitantly, always measuring. Neither of us thought much about it. It was simply who we were. That is why Mark's presence at Christmas felt important. New people bring mirrors. They reflect things we've learned not to question. They shine light on habits and patterns, and they sometimes force you to confront the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Lily had been talking about Mark for months. She said he made her laugh. She said he was quick and charming. She said he saw her strength. I was happy for her, truly. When she told me he was coming for Christmas dinner, I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Not fear, just awareness. A subtle sense that someone new would be watching, listening, making judgments even without meaning to. I wondered what version of me would show up that night. The older sister, the quiet one, the invisible one. When Mark arrived, he was polite and confident, the kind of presence that fills a room without effort. He shook hands firmly, his smile easy and natural, as if he had known us for years. He joked comfortably, and people laughed at the right moments. It was the kind of charm that draws people in without them realizing it. At first, I relaxed, thinking maybe I had worried for nothing. We cooked together in the kitchen, passing dishes and utensils back and forth, sharing small laughter over burnt edges of rolls or slightly overcooked vegetables. For a moment, I thought I had nothing to fear. But old patterns don't disappear just because we hope they will. They wait. They watch. They reveal themselves when we least expect it, like shadows lengthening in the corner of a familiar room. By the time we sat down at the table, the roles were already in place. Lily glowing in her usual effortless way, radiant with laughter and warmth. Mark entertaining, drawing attention with his stories and jokes. Everyone else engaged in the conversation, following his rhythm. And me, smiling softly, ready to keep the peace, keeping my hands folded neatly, occasionally nodding, a silent observer tethered to the background. I did not know then that one sentence would pull years of quiet learning to the surface. I did not know how deeply it would reach into memories I had tucked away neatly, like boxes stacked in the attic. But my heart always knows before my mind does, and it knew something was coming. Dinner that night started the way it always did. Plates clinked softly against the table, and the subtle scent of rosemary from the turkey mingled with cinnamon from the freshly baked rolls. Someone reached for the salt, someone else asked for bread. The room was full of movement, but nothing felt rushed, nothing chaotic. I sat in my usual seat, not at the head of the table, not at the center, just close enough to feel included but far enough not to interrupt the flow. It was a position I knew well, a safe harbor in the predictable rhythm of family gatherings. Mark sat across from me, next to Lily. He leaned back comfortably, one arm resting casually on the back of his chair. He looked relaxed, like he belonged there already, and that was not a bad thing. I wanted him to feel welcome. I wanted my sister to feel happy. And yet, a small part of me, buried under years of careful observation, started to tense. Conversation moved easily at first. Work stories exchanged, whether complaints, plans for the new year. I listened, nodding when it felt right, smiling when someone looked my way. Mark spoke with confidence, telling stories quickly, layering humor into the simplest of moments. People laughed without thinking. Lily laughed the loudest, her eyes lighting up every time he spoke. I watched them from across the table. They looked happy together, comfortable, connected, and that made me glad. But as the evening went on, the jokes came faster, sharper, not cruel but careless. The kind of humor that doesn't stop to ask who might be listening closely. At one point, my mother mentioned something from our childhood, a simple story about school mornings, about rushed breakfasts and forgotten lunches. She smiled softly as she spoke, lost in memory. Mark leaned forward, interested, asking questions, laughing at the right moments. Then his eyes turned toward me. "So you were always the quiet one, right?" he said, smiling. "The one who just kind of faded into the background." The table laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, not roaring, not mocking, just enough to keep the moment moving forward. I felt my face grow warm. My hands tightened slightly around my fork. For a second, I considered saying something. I could have corrected him. I could have smiled and added context. I could have said, I wasn't forgettable, I was observant. But I didn't. Instead, I laughed, a soft sound, barely noticeable, the kind of laugh that says, "It's okay," the kind that reassures everyone else. Inside, something folded in on itself. The conversation moved on quickly. Someone changed the subject. Wine glasses were refilled. The moment passed for everyone else. But for me, it stayed, the weight of it, the echo of being seen in a way I didn't like. As the night went on, I became more aware of myself, the way I sat, the way I spoke less, the way I chose words carefully, like stepping on thin ice. Every time Mark joked, my body reacted before my mind did, a small tension in my shoulders, a shallow breath, a silent question. Is this another one? He didn't say anything else directly about me, but the feeling remained, like an echo resonating through the quiet spaces inside me. I wondered if Lily noticed. She was laughing, engaged, happy. I didn't want to pull her out of that. So I stayed quiet, retreating into the familiar comfort of observation, even as the room buzzed with energy. Later, when dessert was served, I excused myself early. I said I was tired. No one questioned it. In the hallway, I paused for a moment. The laughter from the dining room drifted toward me. It sounded warm. It sounded whole, and I felt separate from it, fragmented, like an invisible observer in a room where everyone else belonged fully. That night, I lay awake in the guest room. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater and the soft whistle of wind through the trees outside. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. Why did it hurt so much? It wasn't the joke itself. It was the ease with which it was said. The way it fit too neatly into a story I had been telling myself for years. A story that said I was meant to be quiet, that I was meant to fade, that I was meant to be overlooked. I thought about all the times I had been overlooked, not intentionally, not cruelly, just quietly. Family gatherings where people talked over me. Work meetings where my ideas were repeated by someone else and received with excitement. Friendships where I listened more than I spoke, where my words were often swallowed in favor of louder voices. I had told myself this was my nature, that I preferred it this way, that I was content. But lying there in the dark, I realized something uncomfortable. I had been choosing silence to avoid discomfort. And in doing so, I had allowed others to define me, allowed the world to place me into a category I did not fully belong to. And now, Mark's joke had exposed it. It was not about him. It was about all of me, the quiet one, the observer, the one who had lived for years in the background. The days after Christmas felt heavy, though nothing dramatic happened. It was not like a storm had passed, leaving chaos in its wake. Instead, it was quiet, almost imperceptible, like the slow pull of a tide. I went through the motions, work, errands, meals, but inside something had shifted. That moment at the table lingered, a small stone in my chest I could not ignore. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Mark leaning forward, his smile easy, the words he had said hanging in the air like smoke. And every time, I felt that familiar tightening in my shoulders, that shallow breath, the silent insistence of my body. Notice this. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. After all, he hadn't meant to hurt me. He had been charming, funny, polite. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been reduced to a stereotype, the quiet one, fading into the background, and it was not just a joke. It was a mirror showing all the years I had spent shrinking, bending, and silencing myself to make the world easier for others. A week later, Lily texted me, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. She said Mark would be there too. My first instinct was to say no. Avoidance had always felt safer than reopening wounds, even small ones. But something inside me resisted that instinct. A quiet voice, buried under years of habit, whispered, "Running would only keep you stuck." It had been my strategy for years, to stay small, invisible, polite. But this time I felt a flicker of defiance, so I said yes. The cafe was small and warm, tucked away on a quiet street with rain tapping gently against the windows. The soft hum of background music filled the space, and the smell of coffee and baked pastries felt grounding, comforting. It was the kind of place where people could speak honestly without raising their voices, where quiet confessions could slip between sips of lattes. Lily arrived first, and when she saw me, she hugged me tightly. Not the quick greeting hug, but one that lingered just a second longer, as if she sensed that something had been wrong for a long time. Mark arrived a few minutes later, his smile more hesitant than before. He seemed aware, just barely, that things had shifted. We sat down with our drinks, a gentle murmur of other conversations in the background. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was careful, not awkward, but heavy with anticipation. I could feel the pulse of my own heartbeat, the warmth of the cup in my hands, the subtle tremor in my fingers. Mark cleared his throat. He looked at me, not at Lily, not at the table, directly at me. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. His voice was calm, measured, without performance or charm. "I've been thinking about Christmas dinner, about what I said." I listened, keeping my gaze steady, letting the words sink in. There was no need to speak yet. He continued, carefully choosing each word. "I realize that my joke may have crossed a line. I never intended to make you feel small. That was never my goal." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his acknowledgement. It was not a grand gesture, no dramatic explanation, just a quiet recognition of the impact of his words. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. My voice trembled slightly as I spoke, but I did not stop. I told him I believed he did not mean harm. I explained that intentions matter, but impact matters too. I shared that I had spent most of my life being the quiet one, the observer, the listener. That hearing myself described that way, even as a joke, had pulled up years of being overlooked, of existing quietly while the world paid attention elsewhere. Mark nodded as I spoke. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. He simply listened, and in that act, he gave me space I had rarely allowed myself. Lily's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table and took my hand, her grip warm and steady. "I didn't realize," she said softly. "I thought you liked being in the background." That sentence landed heavily in my chest. I told her something I had never said out loud. That liking peace is not the same as liking invisibility, that being quiet does not mean being unaffected, and that I had learned to stay small because it kept things calm, not because it reflected who I truly was. Lily cried then, not loudly, just quietly, like the slow release of understanding she had been holding back for years. She apologized, not just for the joke, but for all the times she had spoken for me, for all the assumptions she had made. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it carried the weight of recognition and love. In that moment, something shifted. Not everything was fixed, not everything was resolved, but I felt lighter. I had spoken. I had been heard. And the truth I had carried silently for years no longer had to sit alone in the shadows. We stayed at the cafe for longer than I expected, talking not just about the Christmas dinner, but about our childhood, about the roles we had fallen into without realizing it, about how easy it is to misunderstand quiet people. Each word, each confession, felt like a small undoing of the patterns we had unconsciously accepted. When we left, the rain had stopped. The air smelled fresh and clean. I took a deep breath and felt something unfamiliar, relief, the kind that comes from stepping into light after years of living in shadow. For the first time, I understood that speaking my truth did not make me difficult. It made me visible. After that conversation at the cafe, life didn't suddenly become easier. There wasn't a clear line where everything felt fixed, where all the weight lifted at once. Healing, I realized, is rarely loud or obvious. It happens quietly, in ordinary moments, in the spaces between routine and reflection. It sneaks in slowly, like sunlight through a crack in the blinds, illuminating corners you didn't realize were dark. The first few days after the cafe visit, I noticed a subtle shift within myself. I felt tired, not physically, but emotionally, as though I had been holding my breath for years and had only just let it out. The kind of release that leaves you weak before it makes you strong. I spent more time alone than usual, not to hide, but to listen to myself, to allow the silence to reveal what had been buried beneath habit and caution. I realized how often I had ignored my own feelings, how quickly I had brushed them aside to make room for others, how easily I had dissolved into the background to maintain peace. At work, I began speaking a little more. Not to dominate conversations or assert myself aggressively, but to participate more fully, to allow my perspective to exist in the space I had long avoided. When I had an idea, I shared it. When I disagreed, I expressed it gently, carefully, but without the usual automatic self-censorship. Each time, my heart raced. Each time, nothing terrible happened. The world didn't collapse. Colleagues listened. Some even seemed relieved. That small, quiet acknowledgement from others surprised me more than I expected. Lily reached out more often in the weeks that followed. She asked how I was feeling instead of assuming. She checked in with a sincerity that went beyond surface politeness. Mark, too, showed a new attentiveness, speaking more thoughtfully when we were together, pausing to ensure his words landed kindly, giving me space to respond. I noticed the subtle shift in our interactions. The dynamics were no longer entirely dictated by old patterns. There was room for nuance, for honesty, for breathing without shrinking. One evening, Lily and I sat together on her couch, the room quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of cars passing outside. She looked at me with something vulnerable in her expression, something that mirrored the conversation we had shared at the cafe. "I've always admired your calm," she said softly. "I've always thought you were stronger than me in ways I didn't understand." I smiled, a real smile this time, not the kind meant to protect anyone or keep the peace. In that small, unremarkable moment, I felt the weight of years lift slightly. Speaking up had not been easy, but it had been necessary. I realized that being visible, being present in my own life, did not make me difficult. It made me human. It made me seen. Over time, I noticed how small changes in my behavior rippled outward. I paused before automatically agreeing to something. I allowed myself to feel discomfort without rushing to smooth it over. I learned that silence can be a choice, but so can speech, and both carry power. I realized that choosing not to disappear was not selfish. It was survival, clarity, and self-respect all at once. Mark's gestures, though small, mattered. He asked for my opinion before making jokes. He acknowledged when something I said held weight. He created a space for me to participate without forcing me into the spotlight. These interactions, ordinary and gentle, felt revolutionary to me. For years, I had existed quietly in the background, and now I was learning that my presence alone was enough. The quietest victories are often the most profound. I began noticing how often I had been apologizing unnecessarily, how habitually I had minimized my own needs. I stopped explaining myself before anyone asked. I stopped laughing automatically when something didn't feel right. Each small act of self-recognition felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had long thought insignificant. I also noticed how my relationship with Lily shifted. It was not perfect, no relationship ever is, but it was honest. We saw each other more clearly, not as competitors, not as reflections of what the other lacked, but as two individuals shaped differently by the same experiences, both carrying our own truths. I understood, finally, that her laughter and confidence were not threats to my own presence. Our differences were complementary, not divisive. Life moved on, gradually, with ordinary rhythms and small gestures of growth. There were moments when I slipped back into old habits, when silence felt easier than confrontation, when disappearing seemed safer. But now, I noticed. And noticing, I realized, was everything. Awareness became my strength. I no longer feared my own voice in the way I once had. One afternoon, standing in front of a mirror, I looked at myself fully for the first time in years. Not critically, not with judgment, but with honest attention. I saw someone who had been kind, patient, and careful for a long time. Someone who deserved to occupy space, to feel, to speak, to exist without apology. That recognition felt like forgiveness toward myself, the first in a long series of small, quiet pardons I was learning to grant. As weeks passed, the memory of that Christmas began to soften. It no longer stung the way it once had. It became a marker, a turning point, a signal of change. Lily and I planned another family gathering months later, nothing formal, just dinner. This time I chose my seat deliberately, closer to the center, not hidden, not dominant, simply present. The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by laughter, by stories, by moments of genuine attention. And when I spoke, people listened. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to perform. I simply existed, and that was enough. The weeks turned into months, and life slowly adjusted to the subtle shifts I had made. I noticed how ordinary moments, once background noise, now carried significance. Walking through my apartment, I lingered at the window, noticing the way the sunlight hit the walls. I made time for small rituals I had ignored before. Brewing tea slowly in the morning, letting its warmth spread through my hands. Sitting in the quiet living room, listening to music without distraction. Reading passages in books that resonated with parts of myself I had long neglected. These small acts of presence felt revolutionary, as though I was reclaiming parts of my life I had habitually ceded to the background. Lily and I grew closer, but in a new way. Our relationship was no longer defined by unspoken hierarchies or silent comparisons. We laughed together freely, but our laughter no longer had to compete. When we disagreed, we did so without fear that our bond would crack. I discovered that I could assert myself in small ways without causing tension. "I need a minute," I told her one afternoon as we planned the family barbecue, and she smiled, understanding without question. "Of course," she said. "Take all the time you need." That tiny acknowledgement, that respect for my own boundaries, felt like a gift I had been waiting for years to receive. Mark continued to integrate himself into our family with quiet awareness. He no longer tried to charm or impress. He simply observed, listened, and acted thoughtfully. One evening, as we sat around the living room after a casual dinner, he turned to me. "I really appreciate you sharing that day with me," he said softly, his tone sincere. I've learned something important, not just about what I say, but about noticing when my words matter more than I think. I nodded, letting the warmth of his acknowledgement sink in. It was not dramatic, but it mattered. Recognition, respect, and listening, these small acts had more power than any grand gesture. I found myself noticing the little things about myself as well. My voice carried a subtle confidence that had not existed before. When I spoke at work, I allowed pauses and let my words settle, instead of racing to fill every space. I allowed myself to be heard without fearing judgment or conflict. Sometimes, I caught myself smiling quietly when I realized I was taking up space without apology. And each time, it felt like a quiet victory, like reclaiming a piece of the self I had long hidden away. Even my sense of home shifted. I began decorating my apartment thoughtfully, placing objects that resonated with me rather than what I thought others expected. A soft throw on the sofa, candles that smelled like pine and cinnamon, a small wreath on the door, all of it made the space feel alive, not just a shelter but a reflection of me. I invited friends over, lingering over conversations that mattered, savoring laughter that wasn't forced. I realized how much joy I had previously missed by trying to remain quiet enough, careful enough, invisible enough. The next family gathering a few months later was a quiet turning point of its own. It wasn't Christmas, just a Sunday dinner, but it carried a weight of intention. I chose my seat near the center of the table, deliberately visible, yet not seeking attention. Conversations flowed naturally. Stories were shared, laughter came freely, and when I spoke, people listened without interruption or dismissive glances. I noticed my mother's eyes soften as I contributed to the discussion. I noticed Lily leaning slightly closer when I laughed at a story. And I noticed myself breathing easier, a subtle relief that came from being fully present. I remembered the Christmas dinner, the joke, the tension, and the quiet ache in my chest. But now it had transformed in my mind from a source of pain to a marker of change. That moment had revealed something essential, my capacity to be seen, to speak, to exist without apology. I realized the joke, once heavy, was now a catalyst for growth, a turning point in the way I interacted with the world. Standing at the window later that evening, I watched the streetlights flicker on as twilight deepened. The world outside was ordinary, yet somehow more vibrant, more attuned to my own awareness. I thought about the years I had spent minimizing myself, quietly deferring to others, shrinking to preserve peace. And I realized that peace had never required my invisibility. Strength had never demanded my silence, and kindness did not mean erasing myself to make room for someone else. I thought about forgiveness, not just of Mark, not just of Lily, but of myself. I forgave the younger version of me who had stayed quiet to protect others, who had believed that being small was the only way to survive. I forgave the cautious habits, the automatic smiles, the silent acquiescence. And I forgave myself for not speaking sooner, for not asserting my own truth, for believing that my voice did not matter. In the quiet of that evening, I realized something profound. Life's smallest moments often carry the greatest weight. A sentence, a pause, a look, a soft acknowledgement. Those tiny moments, unremarkable to anyone else, can shift the course of a person's experience, can illuminate truths long ignored, can create space for transformation. I no longer fear taking up space. I no longer apologize for existing fully, for feeling fully. I have learned that hurt is valid even when others mean no harm. I have learned that speaking, even softly, can change not only how others perceive you, but how you perceive yourself. Sometimes I still feel the pull of old patterns. Silence still tempts me when confrontation feels uncomfortable. Disappearing still seems easier on certain days. But now I notice. Awareness has become my strength. I pause, I breathe, and I choose to exist fully and unapologetically. When I reflect on that Christmas now, I don't remember the joke first. I remember the quiet that followed, not in the room, but inside me. That quiet asked to be heard, and finally I listened. That Christmas didn't break my family. It revealed me to myself. And that revelation, I have learned, is where real healing begins. I still smile, but now it's not a reflex or a shield. It's deliberate, it's a choice, and it feels like home.